Everyone, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. Doug Padgett here. It's Monday, January 24th, and I will say I'm doing double duty without our regular Daniel Dietrich, our producer, on today because of a big snowstorm in Indiana. He doesn't have the internet anymore at his house. Hopefully he'll get it back. I am in Minneapolis where we are just frozen as can be out here. And it's Mondays, and that means we talk about news. We'd love to know where you're coming from, so let us know in all the chat spaces where you are and how life is there. But I'm really excited today because we're not only going to talk about news, we're going to talk about how you talk about news. John Schleuss is the president of a guild that I didn't even know existed. So, John, I am super glad that you're here. Really excited about this. I didn't know that there was such a thing as a news guild, let alone that there was a president of a news guild. So what an honor. What an honor to have you with us today. Tell us a little bit about what a news guild does, and having read about it, it's like, well, I'm sure glad that exists, and that sure seems important. So what is it that you do at the News Guild and as the president?
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Doug. So the News Guild is a labor union. So if people know about the Teamsters or the United Auto Workers, we're basically a labor union, but a labor union of mostly media workers and a ton of journalists from about 348. I don't know why I say about. I know the number exactly. 348 workplaces across the U.S. and about 60 in Canada. Wow. Representing folks from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Minneapolis Star Tribune, near you, Duluth, up in northern Minnesota, Casper, Wyoming, Los Angeles Times, Seattle Times. So it's just kind of all across the country. And we really strive to actually protect journalists and media workers and their jobs, help them increase their power by being able to collectively bargain for better benefits. And do things that make sense. So, make sure that they have editorial protections and that they can make sure that they can go out and cover the news story that they need to do. We've been around since the 1930s. And a lot of my job is to basically support and lift up workers. And right now we're having a ton of workers who are unionizing and joining our union.
So one of the things that a lot of us have noticed about the news is that the more traditional and full kind of newsrooms have changed. And it seems like there's just a lot of, I don't know if you call them contract workers or independent journalists that are contributing. Is that something that's actually happening? Like, is news becoming less inside, the news organization kind of place and more independent news people? And do you see that? Is that true? And if so, is that making a big difference in how we deliver and how we see our news?
Yeah, well, it's radically shifted. So my first full-time job in the industry, after I did a little bit of blogging and a small online-only news website in northern Arkansas, was with the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, which has been around for quite some time. What we're really seeing is a change from the model 20 years ago, where in a newspaper you got this physical printed product that people delivered to your home every morning, and some people are still getting that. But with the emergence of the internet, we've had a complete shift over to a digital space, and then you've got social media coming in where people basically enter these little cores of only the people that are just like them. So you actually lose the ability to hear from outside audiences. But kind of coding all over that is consolidation in the industry. So there's fewer companies owning all these local newsrooms, and specifically in what would be called newspapers, even though it's more than just a printed product. It's like a website and app. Is the loss of newsroom employees at the local level, and we've actually lost in the last 10 years, decade. We've lost half of all of those workers. Goodness. And so they're more consolidated in places like Washington, D.C., where I'm based, or New York or Los Angeles, and we don't have them in the local area. So that's been the real big change, is we just have fewer journalists telling the stories in communities all across the country.
So what does that mean for, obviously people are still getting news. I mean, the irony of all this, these updates that you're talking about, is that most of us see more news than we've ever seen before, right? I mean, I am inundated with it in apps and on social media and in email. Like, there's a lot of reporting seemingly going on, and every day there are these news stories that come up. So what's happening? Does it mean that a smaller group of people are producing the news and redistributing it to newspapers and radio stations and TV stations, like in packages that sort of come to those, and then they put their own branding on it and make it seem like it's coming from their or make it feel like it comes from their news outlet? Or how is it that we have less people working in news and journalism and seemingly more news all the time?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably just like a sense of the feeling of the state of the world right now, right? Like a lot of it is this feeling of bad news, right? Global pandemic, a lot of people dying, and potentially like crime. So you're kind of constantly feeling that, and I think especially like under the Trump administration, there were just so many things that had never been seen before. So there was a lot of headlines associated with that. But a lot of those stories end up becoming more national. So what we're missing and what we're really losing are well-staffed newsrooms at the local area, right? Like I was saying before, who are covering the city council meeting, which may not be the most interesting thing for everyone, right?
I've been to city council meetings, right? Yeah, they're not always the most interesting, but some days.
But if you don't, some days they can be. But if you don't have someone there, then basically no one is being held accountable at City Hall, which means with the loss of local journalists, we see taxes go up, we see corruption go up, and we see partisanship go up because people end up actually retreating into like their Facebook group of friends, and that becomes their source of news, that they're only like seeing what their friends are. But those are self-selected people, right? So you actually are seeing opinions and ideas and things outside of your own bubble less and less and less.
And can you just help me understand one thing that's I always want to ask news people about, and it comes up a lot. Is there a difference between the news and journalism? And I don't mean that as some kind of a gotcha question. It just seems like when journalists talk about journalism, like it's an important, essential part of democracy, and they speak about themselves like a journalist. And then there's like a news reporter who's sort of like kicking out the news. Do you all inside the industry think differently about journalists versus news reporters, or like a newscaster, a person who reports the news? How do you think about all of those pieces?
Well, it's sort of this amazing thing that is so fundamental to the creation of America. Right at the top of our Bill of Rights, like number one, is freedom of the press.
Yeah.
And the founders flawed in a lot of different ways, but they realized basically we're going to try out this thing called democracy, where not everyone, but initially some people have the ability to vote. We don't have a king, we don't have a queen. They have the ability to vote, and if we're going to let people vote, they need to know what the hell there is going on. So I think that the difference, the sort of beautiful thing is there is no license for being a journalist. Anybody can be a journalist. We sort of have self-defined our own code of ethics. And there's 4 of them that are like kind of widely considered. Seek truth and report it. Minimize harm when you're going out and covering a story. Think about the people that you're writing about or interviewing on video or on audio. Be accountable and act independently. And so with those kind of core ethical concepts, we try to really like let people know about the world around them. So I don't know if there's necessarily a difference between news and journalism. It's sort of this, creation of more than 200, at least in our country, more than 200 years of sort of academic thought and practice. 100 years ago, there were a lot of lurid details that we put on the front of newspapers that we probably wouldn't see today. And there was a lot of like editorializing, right? So there is sort of a difference in some places that's kind of controversial in the industry between like what's hard news stories, like these are just the facts, right?
Yeah.
We try to get both sides or attempt to get to objective places. And then there's the opinion side, which is like the editorializing of the events of the day.
Yeah, and a lot of us really, as it turns out, we receive our news from a particular point of view that's closer to editorializing. Yeah. Like I know for me, the news channels that I watch, MSNBC, CNN especially, has moved to be much more editorial, during the Trump years, which I was very glad about because I thought their neutral narrative was actually being used by the Trump administration as its own insider propaganda. But they have kind of made this shift, and it's a little hard now in some of the broadcast news stuff and some of those news streams to ever separate out an opinion piece from a from sort of a news and journalism piece. Do you think, working in the industry, do you think that's important that we make a distinction between those? Like to say, hey, the Fox, newsroom, these are legitimate news people, if someone thinks they are, but their evening time or maybe their morning time, that's editorial, the Tucker Carlson's and that crowd. Like they're doing opinion pieces, and we should separate that out like you would a newspaper from the news story versus the opinion piece. Do you think it's important that we make a distinction? And do you think it's possible in our current news situation to make a distinction between those for most people in their daily news consumption?
I do think it's essential that you make a distinction, because what you end up doing is, if you have someone who, rightly so, like editorial pages, the opinion section in a newspaper can be equated to very similar to like Tucker Carlson. But if you have on Fox News in the evening, but if you don't actually think about what they're doing to the underlying brand, right? Like you actually lose your reputation. So there's a lot of people that aren't in the Fox News bubble who actually consider it as propaganda, right-wing propaganda. And so that brand is actually like hurting Fox's ability to be seen as a source that you can actually believe in, that has a good reputation. So that's a huge issue. But I think it also comes down to an underlying issue of our American education system, which is people don't go out into the world after they go through high school understanding media literacy and being able to actually read something, whether it's an opinion piece or it's in theory fact-based, and actually think about, is this true? Is there a slant to this? Is there coming from a place that might have a particular agenda? People don't spend enough time actually kind of investigating and reading through news to think about that. And that's something we do in our job as journalists, like every day, because, the mayor of City Hall will tell you one thing based on what their priorities are. Right?
Yeah, right.
And then you go and you get the records and they might show, oh, there's something else going on here.
How's the spirit in news journalism right now? I was in D.C. and there used to be like a museum of the news that, I don't know, popped up like in the early 2000s. It was pretty cool. That closed. All this people on all sides of the political spectrum constantly going after the media. And what they really mean is the news, I think. I don't think they're worried about, sitcoms and movies and so on. I think they're talking about when they say the media is not fair, the media doesn't tell you the truth. And I hear this truly on, all sides of the political spectrum. No one feels like the media treats them accurately and honestly. How's the spirit inside the insider group of those that you work with inside the News Guild and the union and all?
I think it's pretty low, if I'm honest. I think like a lot of occupations right now, when people say, and it always kind of hurts my heart when people talk about the media as like a monolith, right? Because they probably are just talking about cable news hosts, right? Who when you're doing live TV, frankly, it is really difficult to make sure that you've got all of your facts right, even if you're not coming with an agenda, right? Like you screw up, right? And so when you talk about it in that kind of monolithic way, it's problematic because there are reporters, out in Duluth in Minnesota. There are those reporters in Little Rock, Arkansas, or in Kentucky. Like those are local journalists, and those people are having a hard time. They're not paid well. In a lot of cases, they haven't gotten a raise in a long time. There was that poor woman who it was like her last week reporting in West Virginia, who was hit by a car while she was reporting live. And, like the reality there is there wasn't a photographer, there wasn't a camera person on the back end who would have seen a car coming and before she was hit by it. But she was hit by this car, and, thankfully she was like uninjured. But it was a really screwed up like view of how journalists, especially local journalists, are doing so much with so little resources and so little backing, and then, feeling attacked when they go out and cover an event. I mean, the January 6th insurrection was this like terrible moment, and a lot of our members from across the country were here covering the electoral ballot count, and they were at fear for their lives because there was this group of people who was blaming them. We approach it when we come into the industry in journalism. We approach it as we're here to be advocates for democracy. We're here to be advocates for our communities, and try to inform them. This is literally the base goal. It's like, we want to tell you what's going on in your community so you can be better at being a citizen of a democratic country.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's always talked about, when we talk about how we are as a nation, it's talked about in this way that it's the one branch of our civic life that holds the other branches accountable. It's a very laudie and significant group, but no, people tend to talk about the media or the press generally like that, but not particularly like that, right? They don't think that about the Atlantic magazine or a particular newspaper, or certainly not their own hometown reporting. We do a lot of work with candidates, and people are always frustrated with the news coverage they're getting, right? So there's just, because I think sometimes inside the world of public opinion shaping, whether it's a product that someone's wanting people to pay attention to, or politics, or any of this, they tend to think the media should be our PR companies, like do our bidding for us, do our work, and that's not the role that they have. So it's spoken about in quite lofty terms, but then on the particulars, it feels like, well, I didn't really get the coverage that I wanted or the coverage that I needed, and all of this. Do you think any of that has to do with how we've chosen to structure our media outlets, the funding sources that they come from, the sort of for-profit, sell some soap during the commercial breaks, and then try to tell the truth during the news times, or that newspapers have to be selling advertising inside the newspaper in order to pay for the newspaper, that we don't do some other kind of models? Do you think any of this struggle has to do with and I'm not saying just something that's changed in the last few years, but just, from the founding of our news outlets, that they've been tied into capitalism and to producing income through, ad sales, which is essentially what they are?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. You look at other countries, democracies across the world that are modern or considered advanced, and you see that actually, in terms of per capita spending, there's much more investment in a lot of other countries through public actual taxation or license fees to support media. So, just to our north, right? Canada is fortunate, has about the same population of California, but they're fortunate enough to have a good, solid investment from the public into the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which acts as a sort of combination of like PBS and NPR, but delivering local, national news in radio and on television. And then you see similar thing in the UK, right? We spend so little money from a public stance into journalism. And, we just have let it all fall onto, let's let capitalism deal with it. Well, I mean, I'll tell you very specifically what that's done. More and more companies have consolidated. And so right now we have hedge funds basically running the newspapers of Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, the Hartford Courant up in Connecticut, the Allentown Morning Call in Pennsylvania, the Denver Post in Colorado. And these hedge funds, they don't care about the journalism. They don't care about those lofty goals we were talking about earlier. They only care about their bottom line. And so what they are looking to is extract as much money as possible and then basically leave a shell of an organization behind, if it even exists after they are in there. So Alden Global Capital is a really big hedge fund that we've done a lot of reporting on. From our stance, we have a lot of members who work there, but Alden Global Capital buys up newspapers and basically extracts all the money they can out of them and then leaves them to just rot. And it's a huge disservice to our communities.
Well, why is it that good journalism isn't a moneymaker? Do you have a sense of that? Like these hedge funds, as you say, or any of the investment groups, their primary concern is their investment. And we have a whole lot of things in our society we should talk about organizations that primarily exist for the fiscal benefit of their own members. And that's all, whether or not they should be able to be involved in public benefit activities or not. We can't get into all that now, of course, but why is it that they wouldn't say, hey, you know what? If we fund really great journalism, that generates income for us. Like, what is it in our society that, because other parts of our society says deliver quality and you can extract greater profits. You do that in restaurants, you do that in entertainment, you do that in automobiles. And then in journalism, it seems like, well, you do great journalism, that's not going to produce, like people don't want to pay for that. Is that true, or do we just have a business model that needs an adjustment so that good quality, top-notch journalism can actually be something that enough people want and are willing to pay for, that it's actually a money-making option? Or do you think the only option is to get this out of the for-profit side of our economy?
I think there are several options. One of the biggest issues that we have is that the industry is actually profitable, but it's not profitable to the degree at which like a hedge fund, which is just trying to get like to 16% profit margins, wants to be, right?
Every year. Yeah, right.
Every year. And that's impossible for a lot of industries, but I mean, particularly for news. So it actually is profitable.
I see.
Companies like the New York Times, for instance, I mean, have grown massive amounts of subscribers, which has increased the number of dollars that they're seeing come in. And a lot of our community newspapers are actually doing decently, not great, but decently. And so they're actually able to do quite well. But they're just not able to get to that profit margin that like Wall Street banks and vulture hedge funds want. So that's a big issue. But I think we've also seen the emergence of a lot of different new types of building off of it. And I'm talking about like nonprofit newsrooms. So ProPublica is one that's quite large. The Vermont Digger, the VT Digger, we represent the workers there. That's the largest newsroom in Vermont, and it's a nonprofit organization. The Texas Tribune is another nonprofit news organization, and so there's a lot that have sprung up that have been, I think, really insightful, and that's good because then the money that comes out of there, if there's additional revenue, gets invested back in the organization, and that's what we need to do instead of trying to extract it and send it to Wall Street or the Cayman Islands like these hedge funds will do. But actually reinvest those profits back into the newsroom, because then they end up being stronger, because people actually do want news. They want to know what's going on. They're curious. Right. We're just curious beings.
I heard something, I think it was on a radio show called On the Media, and they were talking about this phenomena that we all knew was happening from 2015 forward, that they refer to as the Trump bump in news, and people subscribing, and that there was all these people who were like, oh my gosh, I'm willing to pay $19.99 a year, or $39 a year, or whatever, to get more news, because this is just bananas and I feel like I need to be more informed. And then the huge drop off after that. Is that true? Have you seen that across the industry? Is that did I hear that right? And did they say that right?
Yeah, anecdotally, I haven't listened to that particular episode of On the Media yet. I'm probably referring to like the Washington Post in specific, because they really did a lot of coverage of the White House during that 4-year period. The New York Times has kind of a different thing happening. They've got a huge increase of subscribers, like I said earlier. But back when I started in the industry, we used to say that for every dollar that was brought in from any source of revenue, 90 cents of that dollar came from print advertising. And the rest, 10%, was, from subscriptions, right? From what people actually pay to get their either digital or print subscription. So we've seen at places like the New York Times and a lot of other places now where the model shifted, where more and more percentage of that revenue is coming from subscribers, which is, I think, potentially good, because it shows that these organizations have to be accountable to the people who are reading the publications rather than to companies that are advertising in the publication. That, I think, is a good symbol. But we've also seen kind of awkwardly, the New York Times, for instance, has more digital-only subscribers in Dallas than the Dallas Morning News, or in Los Angeles than the Los Angeles Times. Local publications, I think, are struggling to get those numbers up. And there's a lot of factors to that, but that's been, I think, a big challenge.
And I probably shouldn't put you on the spot about this, but these paywalls, like when you try to read an article and it says you can't read any longer until you subscribe, oh my gosh, I don't know. There's just something about those that just drive me bananas. Like I pay for news. I do all that stuff. I have lots of subscriptions and I'm into it. And then I run into one and I hit this little paywall. And I don't know, all of a sudden it feels like the relationship just shifted and something doesn't seem right. So I have all this, worry about like maybe driving so much revenue from readers actually has a real downside, that there's the kinds of things that people click on and the kinds of stories you can track, digitally, how people are responding. And I'm sure that drives a certain headline culture and a certain kind of story culture, and how much it's being shared socially might not also. So I guess I'm just raising, like, maybe that's another problem, right? In sort of the fiscal structuring of all of this, that if it's really down to that, frankly, it feels a little bit like the move away from the move that a lot of politicians have done, going to small donations from individual donors, has actually caused the right to lean even harder into its base, right? And like trying to whip up $15 contributions a month from thousands of people causes them to not care about a whole lot of other issues. I wonder if the same thing happens in news, because the financial numbers are so small for any subscription, and you have to get so many people and someone's probably running spreadsheets on a daily basis about, right, like how many people are canceling their subscriptions, and that's becomes 50% of your worry. Is there any of that conversation happening that boy, maybe the solution here has its own level of problem?
Yeah, it is a conversation that's happening right now. It's sort of an interesting thing, because back, when the internet was first kind of a thing in the mid 90s, a lot of different news organizations, particularly in newspapers, treated it as an experiment. Like at the LA Times, for instance, they wouldn't even put the people who built the website in the same building. They were in like a separate building,
Wow.
like 3 blocks away. And it was just like, go have this little experiment, right? Enjoy. This is not ever going to work out, but let's try it out, the internet. And of course, like, to do that, what was done was they put all of the news articles online for free. And so people like kind of had this assumption that then all things online should be free in terms of information. But then, part of the thing we were talking about earlier, there's this thing that will happen where people will aggregate news. So then they'll basically copy and paste what's on one website and put it on another website and act like it's their own. So that becomes a bit of a problem. But we've had this increase of paywalls and subscriptions really over the last, 5 to 10 years, where more news websites, ask for a subscription. And again, I think that comes back to the idea of capitalism sort of solving the market, right? Like, these companies need to survive. It costs money to employ a journalist who's going to go to City Hall and do the stories necessary, for the community. The sort of other thing that we haven't really discussed is it actually ends up, why I think you should pay for journalism if you can. It actually ends up hurting a lot of people who can't afford those subscriptions, right? Like, there are a lot of people in this country who can't afford, a subscription to their local newspaper online. And that means that they can't get access to potentially life-saving information, like what's happening in the pandemic, which schools are open, what the school boards are doing. That's a real problem for people who actually can't afford a subscription. They're completely locked out.
All right, so I'm obviously not the right person to sort of brainstorm the solution to this, but you think about the way Canada does it, that the tax dollars, a portion of those are set aside and then distributed across the whole system through the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting System, and all. Is there any movement to have like a big fund in the United States that doesn't, maybe some of it comes from local governments or something, but it also comes from individuals, where you sort of pay in and that gets distributed across the system? And if you're a member of that, you get access to all of these places, instead of, I think in our comments here, Dave Ron Fox makes a comment, he's in Chicago, he watches follows Chicago reporters, clicks on a link, it takes him, then there's a paywall. And, you start adding all these up and it becomes a substantial amount, and you just have to manage all these subscriptions. Is there any kind of movement to build a giant fund that would fund across the system for all kinds of reporters, something more similar? Or is the United States just simply too big and complex of a country and far too expensive for anything like that to ever work?
Oh, I think we could definitely do it. I mean, we could definitely do it. Is there a movement there now? Sort of in fits and starts, right? Like, we already have public media that people really love. It's called PBS and NPR. And, where Dave is in Chicago, one of the places where we represent the reporters is the Chicago Sun-Times, which just was bought by WBEZ, the local NPR affiliate.
Oh, really?
So that's a place where, an NPR does not have a paywall, right? Because it's supported by member contributions and from partially the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So there is that model. It's way underfunded. really underfunded. So like if we want to fund that more, we should we should increase that. But one of the best things that is potentially there is tax credits for local news jobs. And part of our effort, we have a campaign called Save the News. And
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Okay, yeah. Oh, so let's start talking about that.
Yeah, and one of the things that's kind of like a bit of a live thing right now is a tax credit for local journalists. So a corporation that employs local journalists could get up to a $25,000 tax credit, whether they're in a newspaper or a broadcast station, digital only, whatever. If they're following the goal of actually being local journalism, they could get a $25,000 tax credit for every local journalist that they employ, up to like 1,500.